Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Frank Bruni's The Age of Grievance. I'll talk a little bit about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Frank Bruni is a writer for the New York Times. He's also a professor at Duke. He's written a few different books, some on, I think he wrote a book about George W. Bush, as well as a book on cooking. This book is also about politics, and is about really what he sees as the rise of grievance culture in the United States. Um, he kind of pegs it to the beginning of the Trump administration, and Donald Trump runs throughout this book pretty heavily. Um, and basically, how both parties are playing into these grievances. They're moving the electorate to extremes of two separate ends, and they are basically leaving a lot of people in the middle unrepresented. And the book looks at why this may be, and spends a little bit of time at the end on some possible solutions to this issue. Um, I think that Frank Bruni does a good job of culturally getting his arms around the issue. I think he notes that he doesn't see this as equally both sides. He mostly puts the onus on the Republicans. I will say this was written before Donald Trump was shot, so some of this stuff where he talks about the violence on one side versus violence on another, if you update that changes the calculation. It changes the calculation a little bit, but kind of drives his point home that there's violence on both sides. And part of the reasons that you have this political violence is because of the extremists on use of language and use of calls for political violence in order to uh, politically gain access to policy. And he points out that this has been slowly getting worse. Um, for a while, he points to some surveys to show that there's a stunningly large number of Americans who believe that the use of violence is justified if they don't get what they want, if the other side has maybe cheated or played unfairly. Um, and he has a little bit of his personal experiences in the book, dealing with people who have reached out to him after um, his articles on certain subjects, and people have been very angry. The whole point of the book, the main thing I would say about the book is about anger and people's frustrations and how those are being exhibited online. There's a lot of narcissism that he talks about in the book. He interviews experts. I can't remember the woman's name. It's not Jean Turney, but it's similar to Jean Turney, who wrote a book on millennials way back when, but has also been kind of an expert on the rise of digital culture, which is a large part of the book of how this is driving people to really higher and higher levels of not only shunning people or calling people out for ableism or whatever it is or privilege, but also turning it back on themselves and being something, playing the victim card, for lack of a better term. That's a large part of the book where he kind of talks about how there's a victimization along many lines of culture, as far as people feeling like they are victims, and how that poisons the culture and prevents people being able to work together. Um, he looks at the rise in the ability for corporations to separate people, and he gives this example of the Joneses and the Jacksons, I think it is, where the Joneses are an upper middle class family. They're going to Disney World and they fly first class, first coach, and they get to Disney World and they have a fast track pass. They get advantages that the less affluent folks don't get. This is a point that was made way back when I read Dreamland, is this idea of dicing people up into different financial segments and giving people perks based on their ability to afford certain things. He kind of points that as a growing sense of resentment towards people who are able to afford those things. He talks a little bit about how there's this pessimism decline in the culture. So he covers a lot of stuff very, very briefly, and I think all of that is fair game, and I think a lot of that makes sense. He kind of makes a point to always say that, in this age of grievances, there are grievances that are valid and there are grievances that are not valid. He has a large portion of the book where he talks about the January 6th and how this was, I think, in his mind, kind of a turning point for these grievances. He's a college professor. He talks a little bit about what that experience has taught him. But he sees basically the heroes in this story are people who are able to be humble and have humility and work with people one on one. And he feels that there is a separation that is happening in the culture, partly I think because of uh, the desire the drive to identify as a certain group and then exclude yourself from other groups. And he has some recommendations towards the end of the book of how he would handle that and kind of try to bring more people together. Um, I thought it was interesting. If you're not someone who's thought about these things very much, that I think this would be an interesting book for you. A lot of the book felt to me kind of a grab bag of different news stories in the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Brittany Griner, the high school students at the steps of I think this was the Lincoln Memorial, uh, who were confronted by the Native American drummers. He covers that story. Um, there's a lot of these stories where people have kind of picked sides before the facts are all there, and he is showing this as a kind of a rush to judgment that we have in society based on these perceived identifications, these identities that are doing a lot to pull people apart. He kind of talks about his kind of experience as both a white man and a gay man, and how that also has complexity in his life of how he sees himself and how he sees victimization and how that changes that. He talks a little bit about that. He interviews some other people. There's a gentleman whose autobiography he quotes, and he basically said, my grandfather was my grandfather on my mother's side was white. He never was very virulent racist, never left like 5 miles from his house, whereas grandfather on his dad's side was black, and he was like a relatively well-traveled person, and he didn't see this person having, obviously he had some privilege, but he was also seemed to have a very miserable life, and kind of pointing out the complexities in that I thought was interesting. um, I think this book kind of suffers from a lot of these books where there's this problem. I think Richard Reeves calls this the 11th chapter problem, where there's perception of all these problems in society, or this one big problem, in this case the age of grievances, of how people have seemed to be more and more aggrieved, largely through this online culture. And he explains this through the first 10 chapters of the book, and then has to wrap the book up with a chapter 11 on how to kind of deal with this. And I think he does a good job of kind of the identifying the issues of kind of this. He doesn't really get into, as other books have gotten into, this kind of politics replacing religion, which I think is a really important idea, which to me kind of explains a lot of this. And he goes a little bit into the language and how language has changed and how that has its own fault lines. So there's a lot there, but the 11th chapter problem that he has, I think, is also where the book kind of suffers. It suffers because, in my opinion, it either is too small to make a difference, or if it were enacted across the board, would also cause problems that may even be worse than the thing it's trying to solve. To give an example of something like that, he talks about trying to, and he's building off of the work of Deaton and Case, who wrote Deaths of Despair, which is a book I read a couple weeks ago. I didn't review it for the channel because it was one of those things where I didn't know what to add to it. But Deaton and Case have pointed this out, that you have white working class people who don't have a college degree or suffering these deaths of despair. This book came out in 2020, even before COVID. This was happening, of why they're dying basically in their 40s and 50s from alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide. One of the drivers that they identify is the lack of a college degree. And what Frank Bruni champions in this case is, just as an example, was the state of Pennsylvania basically has decided to open up its jobs to non-college graduates. So 92% of its jobs are now open to non-college graduates. And I think Bruni tries to play both sides of a lot of these things. And so he kind of is on the fence a little bit and has this preamble, well, I think college is great and allows people to learn about themselves and yada, yada, yada. Those things are all true, but he's also, thinks that we should give people without a college degree a chance to get into jobs where a college degree isn't required. And I certainly agree that there are too many jobs that require a college degree. The flip side of that, though, is if we are telling more and more people to go to college, and there's this feeling that there will be a gap between the number of people who are going to college and the number of jobs requiring a college degree, then a couple of things have to happen. Either there has to be training to get those people who don't have a college degree up to the level of college, paid for somehow, some way. Right now we do that through college, and there's a wage premium after college that pays people back for going to college. Or you're going to have a continued gap. You're also disincentivizing people from going to college. If you're telling them these jobs will be open to you, you're going to be put into the same application pool as people who didn't go to college, which means you're going to be less likely to get the job. That's how that works. You may have a sparkling personality and be able to somehow rise above the ATS. I don't know. But for a lot of people, they look at that and go, well, you're disincentivizing going to college. And that may not be the worst thing in the world, given the cost of college, but that's not likely to get you a society that's going to drive college obtainment up. He also talks about national service. I did a podcast on national service. I served in 2 years at AmeriCorps. I'm very proud of my service there. I learned a lot in that program. I'm very pro national service. I don't know if I'm pro mandatory service. I kind of go back and forth. The issue with mandatory national service is that the cost would be exorbitant. I estimated it to be, and I'll leave a link below to that podcast that I did just if anyone wants to check that out. It'll be like $300 billion if you have $100,000 per person. It's 3 million people a year, which is roughly the number of college students who graduate each year. So it'd just be an exorbitant cost. And so he calls for a national service program akin to AmeriCorps. He doesn't call it AmeriCorps on steroids, but I believe that's probably what he would be envisioning. Doesn't really go into depth on that, but the benefits of that would be bringing people who normally don't come together to solve problems, which is actually how you build relationships. And I think you build tolerance and understanding through those things. So I understand the benefit that he's talking about, and I'm not disagreeing with the benefit. I just think that may be a cost that America is not really willing to pay. At least I have not seen them willing to pay the cost that you'd have to continually pay to do this program the right way, in my opinion. And he talks about ranked choice voting and how ranked choice voting would lead to more moderate candidates. And the evidence, I think, there is probably more true than not true, but I don't think it would be an absolute thing that would really drive that to be the case for a lot of things across the board. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know what degree ranked choice voting in all circumstances would lead to more moderate candidates being elected. That I just don't know. So I will admit my ignorance on that subject and say I believe directionally that's probably true. I don't know if that's absolutely true. And then finally, he talks about my biggest issue with the book, and the issue that he kind of comes to again and again, and says, every social movement that has ever started in this country has started with grievances that are valid. And the book does not try to give you any kind of rule of thumb or framework for understanding whether a grievance has moral or philosophical underpinnings to support it. And that to me was one of the things that was missing from the book. And we can kind of talk through all these things where it's like, I think this is a grievance that is not valid. This person may think it is a grievance that is valid. How do you determine that? And is there a framework to do that? And this book really doesn't do that. And so I realize this is probably not Frank Bruni's strength. I mean, he's a journalist. He's not necessarily a philosopher. But I found that to be kind of sorely lacking because there was a little bit of like first principles of, well, what are we actually talking about here? When we talk about grievance and you don't have a way to tell me is the grievance valid or not valid, then it just kind of goes to an opinion. And how do we base that opinion? Is it based on someone's current state? Is it based on the harm of the grievance? Is it based on the perception of the grievance? It just, to me, was like a never-ending like bunch of questions of just like, well, what are we actually talking about here then when we're talking about whether a grievance is real or not real, and who decides that, and how do we decide that? And the book's not really interested in saying that. It's basically interested in saying, we have a nation of people who feel aggrieved. Many, many people feel aggrieved. I would argue he kind of, I don't want to say he dances around some of the issues of why there's this feeling of a grievance, but I had just got done reading and reviewing. I'll leave the link below to The 50s by David Halberstam, and I didn't really talk about it very much in that book, but that is a book where America's economy is exploding, and there is a closing of the Overton window, and there's this prosperity of just people doing really, really well. The number of children are exploding. The technology is exploding. Home ownership is exploding. So there's this real surge of prosperity that I think papers over all these frustrations that are underlining it. Maybe Sylvia Plath, I don't know who the poet is, but there's a famous poem about a lake that seems to be placid on the surface but is roiling underneath the lake. In some ways that is America in the 50s, and it comes out in the 1960s, but the prosperity of the 50s kind of covers that. And so that to me is one of the things that when we're talking about grievance, why there may be grievance, that some of this has to be talked about in the form of economics and why there are so many people who feel frustrated by economic growth or lack thereof. So I'm at time. I've been rambling long enough, so I just want to thank everybody and say, who would I recommend this book to if you are really interested in this subject? I think it's a quick enough read. It's only about 245 pages, 250 pages. If you've not thought about this subject much before, if you haven't read similar books, then you may like this. I thought this was breezy. I liked Bruni's his stories that I thought helped out too, and his own kind of wrestling with some of this stuff and his viewpoint as a college professor. I thought were real helpful. I don't know how much I learned on this. I think Bruni is obviously New York Times writer. I think he comes from a leftist center viewpoint, and some things that are really, really important to him maybe are less important to me. But if you're someone who hasn't thought about this a lot, then I think you'll learn a lot from this book. If you have liked this video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll leave those links below. Until next time, bye.